Right. Good evening, Dr. Wright. Thanks very much for your time. Now, just tell us how you compiled this report with Joanne Calitz. You obviously were able to look back at what happened in 2019 when we actually went to level 6 load shedding. How did you come up with predictions, such dire predictions, for 3 years potentially of load shedding?
Yes, so thank you for the time and the opportunity to share some of this research. Interestingly enough, it's actually some research we published at the beginning of the year that we were energized into doing over the December holidays and then into January after the stage 6 load shedding that we saw. Of course, no one foresaw COVID-19 and the reduced demand as a result of that, which is why when we started to experience load shedding in the first 3 months of the year up until the middle of March, we were thinking it really wasn't going to look good for the rest of the year. We already saw 90% of the 2019 levels of load shedding within the first 3 months. But then we went into lockdown to try and mitigate the spread of COVID-19, of course, and the demand then reduced quite significantly in the order of 20 to 25% on a weekly basis relative to what was expected. As we went from level 5 to level 4 and then into level 3 of the lockdown, the demand really just came back quite quickly. Our industrial activities ramped up again, and we really are back to normal, if we could say that, back to what was expected. The result of which we saw in the middle of July, where we started load shedding again, and then of course today and possibly into the weekend where we're starting to load shed again as a result of further breakdowns in the Eskom generation fleet.
How have you come up with your worst case scenario, which is 3 more years of load shedding? What leads you to believe that that could actually happen if the right decisions are not made now?
Yeah, so what we tried to do is 2 things. Number one, highlight the problem and really say that it could be this bad. The reason that we say that is really trying to energize people into action, number one. But number 2, probably more importantly, we then said to ourselves, well, if it could get this bad, what needs to be done to rectify it? What are the steps that could be taken, and how fast do we need to act to make sure that this does not happen? When doing this analysis, we didn't actually think that this was going to be a worst-case scenario that we considered as part of some of the research. But it seems like the Eskom coal fleet, what's called that energy availability factor, or the reliability of the coal fleet, is really tracking in that lower bound that we considered in the research. So this is why we are load shedding. This is why we perpetually are going to see load shedding for the rest of this year, most likely, and into the next year and years thereafter, if we don't take the relevant mitigation, put the relevant mitigation actions in place in order to really minimize the effects of load shedding.
All right, so what needs to be done? And you make the point, it is not only up to Eskom, it's also NERSA, the Department of Public Enterprise, Department of Energy. There needs to be a sort of a galvanizing and a sense of urgency. Tell us exactly, practically, what they should be doing and whether they are doing it and whether they're doing it quickly enough.
Look, I think they would be able to speak to them for themselves, of course. I won't try and speak on their behalf, but at least in terms of what we've put forward as some suggestions and solutions to the problem that we see, we split it into 3 key steps. One is the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy Risk Mitigation Power Procurement Program. And in that power procurement program, they're looking at procuring in the order of 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts of capacity. It's unclear so far how far along that is, but I understand that the request for proposals that's part of that program will be coming out in the next few weeks. The next step is really about implementing of our existing policy, which is the Integrated Resource Plan 2019, which will then get capacity online from 2022 onwards. So that's more of a medium-term mitigation action. But having looked at those 2 and the timelines that we have available, we're already in the middle of 2020. We probably are already behind on some of them and will need significant acceleration of those programs in order to really mitigate those load shedding numbers that we showed in the research that we published. I think the final step is really the one that you can take action on quite quickly, and I think we have done that in the first half of this year, but we could probably do a bit more, is really the significant customer response at scale, which would include distributed generation and embedded generation options across different customer classes, all the way from the residential sector to commercial and agricultural to light industrial and the very heavy energy intensive users in the mining sector. In those sectors, you can really get significant response in a very, very short amount of time and try and then minimize or at least lessen the burden on the remaining part of the power system and on the Eskom coal fleet.
just explain that last point to me. Break it down for me a little. Are you just saying that that's about using as little electricity as possible?
Well, on one side, of course, you could put in some energy efficiency interventions, but it's really about deploying self-supply options that are, I would say, more relevant to smaller customers. So the likes of solar PV and the technology costs that have really dropped in recent years makes it a very strong business case for businesses to invest in this. Mm-hmm. This is in the commercial and the industrial space. For residential electricity consumers and customers, of course, it's not always affordable to everyone. So one of the suggestions as well as part of the research is really trying to incentivize and try and make it easier for residential customers to do more for themselves. Now, when we say this, we are very clear as well that we don't want people to be going off grid. We just are suggesting that there are ways in which you can complement your existing electricity offtake that you take from Eskom with your own supply options. And then when that supply is not there, you are still going to be getting power from Eskom. What it does do is it then minimizes the load on Eskom at some very high demand hours. Of course, not into the evening peak unless you have storage, but it really does help quite significantly, and that was one of the bigger outcomes of the work that we published.
All right, so you're suggesting that it's something that individual households could look at, of course, businesses as well. So for example, you're talking things like solar panels, gas geysers, that sort of thing.
Indeed, yes. And in the residential sector, you don't really get much of a response, actually. We won't necessarily have that many customers that, number one, will even be able to afford it from a capital expenditure perspective, so how much money a household will need to spend on it. But number two, there aren't that many finance mechanisms in place yet. I think they're being developed over time, and a lot of the big banks are starting to think about this a lot more carefully in the way that they do mortgages, for example, for houses. But the real big numbers that you get is in the commercial and industrial space, and then in the big energy-intensive users, where they start to deploy much bigger power plants at a time.
All right, so that's what you're saying is when there needs to be an entire response, a holistic response. It's everything from the banks saying, well, if you need a new geyser, we're going to subsidize you if you take a solar geyser plan, that sort of thing. It's from that very small detail right up to the big decisions.
Indeed, yes, and I think some of the packages to enable this to happen could really incentivize that type of behavior. We need to always be careful, specifically in the residential sector where a lot of cross-subsidization happens, that we don't then burden the remaining customers that are remaining on the grid with those that are then leaving the grid if they start to say to themselves they just don't want to be on the grid at all anymore and deploy solar PV with storage that sufficiently says they can just open the switch. That's why we're very clear in a lot of our recommendations that you should remain on the grid as much as possible, but try and help the power system if you can by deploying some of these solutions. And it includes yourself as an individual customer, it includes businesses as well as the financial sector, and of course the enabling regulatory framework from national government perspective. So the likes of NERSA, the DMRE and others would really need to step in and assist there to try and drive that and incentivize and communicate that to customers.
Well, thank you so much. A really fascinating discussion. Dr. Jared Wright, Principal Researcher in the Energy Centre at the CSIR, also one of the authors of a report on load shedding and how we can revitalise our power